In this video, Viki1999 attempts to prove that socialism is not authoritarian, but mainly just defends authoritarian ideologies. Viki poisons the well immediately by saying those who are against socialism are right-wing.
Among rightists like libertarians, small government conservatives, or even anarcho-capitalists, you will very often find that socialism is bad, because socialism is authoritarian, which inherently makes it less free than whatever their political goal happens to be.
This leaves out social democrats and centrist liberals. The argument starts with a presentation of the definition of socialism from Google, a political and economic theory of social organization which advocates that the means of production, distribution, and exchange should be owned or regulated by the community as a whole. She says,
"As you can see, it says nothing about authoritarianism."
As if that proves anything. This definition is not helpful at all because it could conceivably refer to any system in which the government regulates the economy at all, and I don't think socialists are willing to describe countries like the US in that manner. A better definition is the one provided by Britannica. Socialism, social and economic doctrine that calls for public rather than private ownership or control of property and natural resources. For the purpose of deciding whether socialism is authoritarian or not, it is more helpful to divide socialism into two types: revolutionary socialism and reformist socialism. She then says,
Matter of fact, you can have an economy which completely follows this definition without having a government at all. That's something anarcho-communists could have told you before.
She says this is enough to prove that socialism is not necessarily authoritarian, but this argument is poor. Just because an ideology advocates for a system with no government, that doesn't mean it's not authoritarian. Anarcho-communism aims to overthrow liberal democracy with a revolution, which makes it inherently authoritarian. Any ideology that seeks to undermine the democratic system and the rule of law is authoritarian no matter what its stated aims. If the people wanted the system, they would vote it in. This means that any form of Marxism and any form of anarchism, aside from anarcho-pacifism, is in the authoritarian category. Curiously, almost all of the nations defended in her video are of these types. The only kind of socialism that is not inherently authoritarian is reformist democratic socialism. After failing to prove that socialism isn't authoritarian, the video advances to the actual main topic. Why are all socialist countries in history authoritarian?
The rightist argument goes that every time socialism was tried, it turned authoritarian.
Poisoning the well again.
And because of this precedent, we shouldn't even try to achieve a better society, because if it happened then, it could happen again.
That's a total straw man. People who aren't socialists don't think striving for a better world is useless, they just don't think socialism is the way to get it. After 2 minutes of talking about how within the left there's lots of contention on which countries were actually socialist, it is decided that any country that calls or called itself socialist will be counted for the video.
This means, for this video I will count the Soviet Union, China, North Korea, the entirety of Eastern Europe, as well as much of Africa and South America, as socialists. Depending on the time period, of course. There is no socialism in modern-day Eastern Europe. Looking at those countries, we can see a lot of authoritarianism. Secret police, one-party states, centralized bureaucracies, dictators and gulags. Truly Orwell's nightmares. Except Orwell frequently reported people to the secret police, so Orwell's dreams.
That's not what happened at all. The IRD was not the secret police. They made anti-Soviet propaganda. It's totally fine to be against government agencies making propaganda, but nothing happened to these people. They were only given as people not to be recruited to make propaganda, as it was a secret government organization. If you're hiring people to write anti-Soviet propaganda, it makes sense to make sure they're not pro-Soviet.
There is the idea, especially online, that socialism is inherently authoritarian because socialism uses a centrally planned economy which inherently promotes a rule of the few over the many. On the topic of bureaucracy in the USSR, Eagleton makes a materialist argument. The theory is that to reach socialism or communism, you need the people to have a lot of materialist things, like coats and shoes. They just created one big efficient factory that mass-produced coats. and then they somehow had to manage this factory and the distribution of the products throughout the entire country. And because of the need to do this for every single product, a centralized bureaucracy developed as a result of the Russian conditions. So reason 2 why socialism is authoritarian: a poorly developed country would develop a central bureaucracy when trying to reach socialism. That's the Eagleton take.
This theory seems to be damning for socialism. If the government being largely involved in industry will lead to it having tight control of the economy, it seems very unlikely that a non-authoritarian socialist system could exist.
There is another explanation for why those countries turned out so authoritarian. It could be because none of them had democracy before they reached socialism. China was a feudalist empire or a fascist dictatorship, depending on the region. Russia was a czarist autocracy.
The Russian provisional government was a flicker of what could have been a culture of democracy in Russia, but the Bolsheviks snuffed it out. It's not that they had no democracy as a basis, they were actively working against democracy.
Both the people and the revolutionaries may have believed that democracy is inherently unstable, which is actually kind of true when compared to a dictatorship.
Democracies always provide clear successors in leadership, while if a dictator dies, it's very easy for a power struggle between different factions to take place. This can be shown with the breakup of Yugoslavia. After Tito's death, the federal government was drastically weakened and the different regions became more autonomous. This created a power vacuum which paved the way for the bloody breakup of the country.
There is something else these countries have in common: civil wars. Every time socialism came into a country, that country was first ravaged by war. So it makes sense that the leaders would grasp onto power tightly and make sure they can't be overthrown by a second civil war. And this is of course another reason to turn away from liberal democracy. If half your country just fought against you, who is to say they won't vote you out?
This would prove that all revolutionary socialism is inherently authoritarian, though, because the revolutionaries refuse to leave power.
So I propose that we're seeing some survivorship bias here. The reason all socialist countries in history were authoritarian is because due to civil wars, the non-authoritarian ones were destroyed.
So if they're not authoritarian, they're destined to collapse under pressure? So non-authoritarian socialism literally can't exist because it can't withstand external threats. It doesn't matter if it exists in theory. If the only possible form of socialism is authoritarian, socialism might as well be inherently authoritarian. Viki references the crushing of anarchist rebellions in the USSR.
One note here: 2 of the mentioned revolutions were crushed by the USSR, which to this day causes infighting on the left. I would like to ask you not to argue about this as much. It was 100 years ago, and we need to get stuff done nowadays. Yes, Trotsky crushing the Kronstadt Rebellion was a dick move, but none of the modern Marxist-Leninists or anarchists were there at the time, so there is no point in blaming each other.
Modern Marxist-Leninists may not have literally been there, but their ideology is in support of those actions. This is like a modern neo-Nazi going, "Oh, I wasn't alive during the Holocaust, why are you getting upset at me?"
Please, work together. There are so many capitalists who deserve to be argued with, so focus on them, please.
This is one of the reasons people see socialism as authoritarian. People like Viki advocate allying with authoritarians just to own the capitalists. Next, Viki goes back to try to disprove the arguments given for why socialism is authoritarian.
First of all, the idea that socialism is inherently authoritarian because it is inherently centralized. Nothing about the definition of socialism says there needs to be a central control.
Google definition again.
Matter of fact, there can be market socialism, decentrally planned socialism, or AI planned socialism.
Whether a planned economy is centralized or not, it still limits choice in the distribution of goods because consumers can't just purchase things whenever they want.
This means the argument that socialism is authoritarian because it is centralized is wrong, because there can be many non-centralized forms of socialism, and those existed historically, for example in Yugoslavia and Argentina.
I presume the Argentine socialism referenced here is Peronism. The 2 non-authoritarian examples are Yugoslavia and Argentina. These examples are bunk because Yugoslavia was a dictatorship under Tito, and Perón was a fascist sympathizer who protected numerous Nazi war criminals after World War II.
Before I mentioned the take of Terry Eagleton, who said that the USSR developed a central bureaucracy because Russia was so poor. His argument continues that because today everyone already has a coat and shoes, there would be no need for such a bureaucracy. This means he believed that because of the different conditions we live in, the next socialist revolution wouldn't need to be authoritarian.
But if it was a revolution in a Western democracy, it would be inherently authoritarian.
The next reason these countries might have fallen for authoritarianism was that they had no history of democracy. And of course, we live in modern Western democracies, so our culture is inherently more critical of authoritarian and less likely to turn to authoritarianism.
This is the only way socialism can be not authoritarian then. Reformist democratic socialism is the only option. Considering the defense of Marxism and anarchism, I don't think Viki would be willing to accept this.
The only cause for authoritarianism that is left is war. And there isn't much I can say about that. If the next socialist revolution is immediately attacked by counter-revolutionaries, it may still turn authoritarian, just to survive.
The framing on this one. They turn authoritarian because they're attacked by counter-revolutionaries. The counter-revolutionaries aren't the ones starting the conflict. The socialists did by overthrowing the system. Don't give me this "they had to do gulags to survive" crap.
But of course it's not up to us whether the US military will start a war against the next socialist nation. And no doubt, if they start a war and the revolution turns authoritarian to protect itself, they will use that to justify hating the revolutionaries. Just like how the USA sent support to the anti-Bolsheviks in the Russian Civil War, which caused the USSR to become militarized, and then the USSR called the Soviets an evil empire because they protected themselves against countries that wanted to harm them, like the USA.
The Russian Civil War and Reagan's evil empire speech were 60 years apart. That characterization is ridiculous. It doesn't make any sense to point to America specifically as the one supporting the White Army. She acts as if America was just trying to hurt the Bolsheviks, but leaves out that this intervention literally started during World War I. The Allies wanted to reopen Russia's front with Germany, and they were supporting the Whites because they were on the same side of the war. They also wanted to evacuate the Czechoslovak Legion, who was trapped in Russia because of the October Revolution. The US also kept troops in Russia because they feared Japan would take over parts of Siberia. American troops pulled out in 1920. The USSR didn't become militarized because the US up and attacked them. They were in a civil war before the Americans even arrived.
In the final section of this video, I would like to ask the question, what even is authoritarianism? But the closer you look at the USSR and China and the other ones, the fewer reasons you have to call them authoritarian.
Yeah, she's a full-on tanky.
Let's pull out the definition. Britannica.com says, authoritarianism denotes any political system that concentrates power in the hands of a leader or small elite that is not constitutionally responsible for the body of the people.
That sure isn't the whole definition. This is the whole definition. Limited political parties is a major feature of authoritarian systems, and the Soviet Union was a one-party state. Laws were made by party officials, with the Supreme Soviet being a rubber stamp legislature.
I have a whole video on this, and to be honest, according to the Soviet constitution, the party was 100% responsible to the body of the people. So the USSR doesn't even fit the definition for authoritarianism, and neither does China.
So just because the Constitution says the party in theory is accountable to the people, it can't be authoritarian. Yeah, and Hitler represented the will of the people. By this logic, the only countries you could call authoritarian would be absolute monarchies.
And if you make the definition broad enough to encompass the USSR, then your definition also includes the USA.
What?
Think about it. Secret police.
The NSA aren't secret police. Secret police are used against political opponents. The NSA, while probably doing things that are unconstitutional, does not target political dissidents. It targets terrorists. The NSA doesn't round up commies.
Centralized bureaucracy.
In the American system, there is balance between the states and the federal government. Many things are left up to the states to deal with. The federal government is strong, but so are the states.
Secret government prisons that arrest people without charges.
They hold foreign combatants at Guantanamo. You can be against them not charging them, but holding enemy foreigners in prisons is different than sending your own citizens to gulags.
A political system that doesn't represent the people and only benefits party members.
First of all, having a two-party system is way better than having only one party. And the US has more than two parties, the others are just not popular. The primary process within the parties allows the people to vote on which candidate they want to run for their party. Just look at all the people running in the 2020 Democratic primary.
We are trained to inherently view authoritarianism as bad, but just calling someone or something authoritarian isn't an argument. It doesn't provide any evidence on how good or bad that thing is. So the question whether socialism is inherently authoritarian is kind of empty because it doesn't judge socialism at all.
Calling something authoritarian definitely is an argument. What are you talking about? Authoritarianism is literally a metric to describe ideologies. This ridiculous video shows that Viki1999 is an authoritarian who wants to play defense for communist countries like the USSR. If she went on to talk about democratic socialism being non-authoritarian as opposed to Marxist socialism, that would be interesting, but it was just tanky propaganda. And most importantly, Felix Argyle would not be a communist. He is loyal to a noblewoman who aims to be the monarch of Lagunica. He is a monarchist catboy. Thank anyone for watching. Feedback would be appreciated. Subscribe for more videos like this.
Thank you!